They tried to bury us under a $950 fine for a mailbox. Just a mailbox. But they had no idea who they were really dealing with. The first time I saw her, it was early evening. The sun had dipped just enough to throw long shadows across our driveway. The air was cool, but I still felt sweat prickling my back, because something about the way she walked toward us made my gut tighten. Her heels clicked sharp against the pavement, each step too precise for casual neighborly chatter. Our gate creaked when I pushed it open, and I remember the dust clinging to my boots because I had just come back from setting up the backyard fence. Ordinary things, but that creak and that dust would stick with me, reminders of how everything started so small and then spun completely out of control. She introduced herself with the kind of confidence that didn't wait for permission. "Roberts, HOA president." She had a tailored blazer on, crisp and expensive, the kind that catches your eye before you even notice her jewelry flashing in the sun. My wife gave her a polite nod, but I could see her studying everything the pen held, the leather-bound citation book, even the way she angled her body like she'd rehearsed the pose in front of a mirror. Tapped the paper against her clipboard as if it were a gavel. "That mailbox installation of yours," she said, "was never cleared by the Architectural Review Board. Standard procedure requires pre-approval." I blinked at her, then pointed up and down the street. Identical mailboxes. Every single house had the same one we did. "It matches perfectly," I told her, trying to keep my voice calm. "Superficial similarity," she replied, writing as she spoke, "doesn't equal covenant compliance." The way she said it made it sound final, like a verdict instead of a conversation. When I saw the paper she handed us, I expected a flimsy slip, maybe something printed off a home office computer. Instead, it felt heavy, like used for wedding invitations. Premium ink flowed across it in perfect script. Even the watermark caught eye. She held it up against the kitchen window later, sunlight pouring through the fibers, and whispered, "This isn't ordinary. This is professional-grade, custom-embedded stock. Look here, CR Enterprises." Roberts CR. I didn't know it then, but instincts weren't the instincts of any ordinary suburban wife. She saw things most people would miss. Details that shouldn't have existed on a community citation, details that screamed this was something bigger, something more organized than a neighborhood rule violation. 3 days, that's all it took before struck again. By then we'd already noticed the whispers, neighbors pulling mail out of their boxes a little too quickly, avoiding eye contact when we waved. Mrs. Anderson from 2 streets over muttered something about being fined 4 times in 2 weeks for things as small as leaving a trash can too close to the curb. The old man down the block, his hands trembling as he carried a holiday wreath back inside, told me he'd been cited for seasonal violations. His paper looked identical to ours, thick, embossed, professional, and expensive. Laid them all out across our dining table like evidence at a crime scene. One after another, she lined up the citations, her voice low and steady as she explained. Sequential numbering, identical paper quality, uniform ink density. This isn't random. This is centralized production. She's not just handing out fines. She's running a business operation. That's when I started noticing other details. The black sedan parked too neatly in its driveway late at night. The leather briefcase a visitor carried inside. The way stood at her door afterward, phone pressed against her ear, packing back and forth under the porch light. I remember whispering to through the kitchen window, "She's meeting with someone important." Raised binoculars I hadn't even known we owned. She didn't answer right away, just adjusted the focus with surgical precision. Then she muttered, "Government plate, stay tissued prefix." That night I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet except for the ticking of our old wall clock. But my mind was loud, replaying heels on our driveway, the weight of that paper in my hand, the look on his face as she pieced together connections that shouldn't have existed. I kept asking myself one question. If this was just about keeping lawns trimmed and mailboxes uniform, why did it feel like we'd just been drafted into a war we didn't even understand yet? Sometimes evil doesn't arrive with sirens or flashing lights. Sometimes it's a neighbor in a blazer, handing you a fine that feels more like a threat. And sometimes, it's the creak of your gate on an ordinary evening, warning you that life is about to change forever. They said it was just a community safety meeting. But the moment I saw the glossy handout taped to our door, I knew was about to try something bigger. The paper felt the same as that fine, thick professional, almost too good for a suburban announcement. Across the top in bold it screamed, "Critical Community Safety Briefing, Immediate Action Required." That phrase alone was enough to rattle people, held it in her hands and whispered, "This isn't about safety, this is about control." That evening our neighborhood center buzzed with unease. The folding chairs were packed wall-to-wall, neighbors fanning themselves with the handouts, whispering anxiously. I heard Mr. mutter behind me, "She makes it sound like the whole town," about to collapse. Another man, shifting in his seat, added, "If property values drop, my retirement goes with it." Stood at the front, bathed in carefully arranged lights that made her look like she belonged at a corporate conference. A projector hummed, slides already waiting on the screen. She didn't start with a greeting, she started with a statistic. "Property values in Heights are at risk," she declared, her voice carrying a rehearsed urgency. "Crime rates are climbing. External demographics threaten stability. We must act now or this neighborhood will lose everything we've built." Charts flashed across the wall. Bright red lines dipping downward, crime bars shooting up. Faces in the crowd paled. I could feel the fear creep in like a cold draft. People believed her. Because the presentation looked official, because she spoke like an expert, because she knew the right buttons to press. But then I glanced at, calm, steady. Her arms folded as she scanned the slides with that look I knew too well, the look she wore when she saw through a trick before anyone else even realized they were being fooled. When paused for effect, rose slowly to her feet. The scrape of her chair against the tile echoed through the room. Everyone turned, and when spoke, her voice cut clean through the tension. "Mrs. Roberts," she said firmly, "could you clarify the data sources for these statistics?" Blinked. For the first time, she looked caught off guard. "These are official safety records," she replied quickly, "compiled through proper municipal channels." Didn't flinch. "Then why," she continued, "does your crime analysis use postal code 94,582 when our neighborhood is located in 94,581? The room rippled with murmurs. His confident smile flickered just for a second, pressed on, her tone calm but relentless. "You're showing crime numbers from an entirely different jurisdiction. You're presenting someone else's danger as ours." A man in the back shouted, "Is that true?" Another neighbor whispered, "I knew those numbers felt too high." Tried to recover, her voice sharper now. "Questioning community safety analysis undermines our ability to protect one another. These measures are necessary." Cut her off. "What undermines community safety," she said firmly, "is fraud, statistics without sources, charts without methodology, fear used as a weapon." The silence that followed was heavy. Neighbors looked at one another, doubt now spreading where fear had been. I saw Mrs. Anderson clutch her hand out, her eyes narrowing at the fine print. Cleared her throat, trying to regain authority. "Mrs., persistent doubt can endanger stability." His reply was a dagger, and persistent lies endanger trust. The room shifted. You could feel it. Half the people still clung to this narrative, too afraid to question it. But the other half, they were looking at now. Not just as a neighbor, but as someone who might finally stand up to the woman who'd been holding this community hostage with paperwork and fear. Afterward, as we stepped into the cool night air, neighbors approached quietly. Mrs. whispered, "Thank you, I thought I was the only one who noticed." A man from Oak Street added, "She's been twisting numbers for months, we just didn't know how to prove it." Gave them a small, tired smile. "Fear makes people obedient," she said softly, "but the truth makes them brave." That night, lying awake again, I realized something. Wasn't just handing out fines anymore. She was testing us. Testing how far she could bend the truth before people broke, and had just given her the first crack in that power. But when you embarrass someone who lives on control, you'd better be ready for the storm that comes after. I thought would back down after exposed her at the meeting, but I should known better. When you embarrass someone who thrives on control, they don't retreat, they escalate. It was the very next morning when we heard the knock at our door, not the polite kind. Sharp, frantic, I opened it to find Mrs. Anderson from Pine Street, her eyes red and swollen. She clutched a tablet against her chest like it was something poisonous she couldn't let go of. "They ruined me," she sobbed, stepping inside before I could even invite her. "They ruined everything." Guided her to the table gently. I stood there frozen as Mrs. Anderson unlocked the tablet and showed us what she'd discovered overnight. Her name plastered across fake criminal records. That didn't exist yesterday. Court documents filled with fabricated charges. Even traffic violations in states she'd never visited. Her hospital had already called, questioning her employment because their system suddenly flagged her as a liability. Mrs. Anderson's voice cracked. "I worked 30 years for that hospital, 30 years, and now they think I'm a criminal." My stomach turned cold. This wasn't a fine. This wasn't a bad statistic. This was character assassination, systematic, surgical, and terrifying. Didn't panic. She leaned forward, scrolling through the files with calm precision. Her eyes moved quick, scanning metadata, cross-referencing timestamps, almost like she'd done this 100 times before. "This isn't random," she murmured. "These weren't hacked in, they were inserted." I frowned. "Inserted?" Nodded, her voice firm now. "Someone used official credentials to plant these records directly into government systems. Look at the formatting, the authentication codes, the access logs. This wasn't a teenager with a laptop. This was someone inside." Mrs. Anderson wiped her tears with shaking hands. "But who could even do that? Who would?" Silence said more than words. I recognized that look again, the one she wore when puzzle pieces were already clicking into place. Within hours, had started what she called a counter-investigation. She moved with a quiet urgency, phone pressed to her ear as she contacted internet service providers, database administrators, even state record offices. She typed fast, her fingers flying across the keyboard as lines of data scrolled faster than I could follow. I asked the obvious question, "How do you even know how to do all this?" She didn't look up. Every database transaction leaves fingerprints, authentication logs, terminal IDs, timestamps. Whoever did this left a trail. Her words sent a chill down my spine, because they weren't the words of a casual user. They were the words of someone trained, someone who had seen this kind of thing before. By nightfall, Mrs. Anderson's fabricated records were gone, wiped out, her reputation restored. The hospital rescinded their threats. It was like the nightmare had never happened. But the way pulled it off, the speed, the precision, I couldn't stop asking myself, who exactly had I married? That evening showed up again. This time no clipboard, no rehearsed smile, just anger simmering under the surface. "Mrs.," she hissed, "your interference with community safety protocols has become problematic." Didn't blink. "Mrs. Roberts," she replied calmly, "systematic database fraud against elderly residents is a federal crime. Identity theft, credential abuse, criminal conspiracy, that's not community safety. That's corruption." For the first time, I saw fear flicker across face. She tried to mask it with a smirk, but her voice gave her away when she muttered, "You demonstrate unusual familiarity with these systems, Mrs." Tone sharpened. I recognize institutional cyber warfare when I see it. Stepped back just one step, but enough to tell me's words had hit their mark. That night I watched Pace on her phone through the kitchen window again, except this time her movements were frantic, her gestures sharp. She wasn't giving orders, she was reporting failure. Sat beside me, jotting down notes with the same patience she always carried. "She's compromised," she said quietly. "Her network will escalate again. They don't know who they're dealing with." And sitting there in the dark, listening to the creak of our old floorboards and the faint hum of laptop, I realized something that scared me more than fines ever could. Wasn't just defending us. She was dismantling them, piece by piece, calmly, methodically. And if kept pushing, sooner or later she was going to find out exactly who my wife really was. You'd think after dismantled the fake charges against Mrs. Anderson would back off. But fear doesn't make people stop, it makes them reckless. The next night, as the cicadas hummed outside and the streetlights flickered against our curtains, leaned across the dining table with that same calm intensity she always carried. Papers spread everywhere, her pen tapping a slow rhythm against the wood. She said, "We've been playing defense. It's time to flip this." I frowned. "Flip it how?" She slid her notebook toward me. On the page, arrows and circles connected names, dates, and symbols I barely understood. "They run like a network," she explained. "Information flows in patterns. If I feed them false intel, I can track exactly where it travels and who it reaches." I blinked like bait. She gave a small, knowing smile, like a trap. The next morning played the role of neighborly chatter perfectly. At the mailbox, while pretending to fumble with envelopes, she muttered just loud enough for the woman beside her to hear, "I heard the feds are auditing HOA finances." The neighbor gasped, promised to keep it quiet, which was exactly what wanted. By evening, I heard screen door slam across the street. Through the blinds, I caught her packing with her phone, voice sharp, movements clipped. Sitting beside me with her laptop, whispered, "There it goes." On her screen, a digital trace lit up. False intel just triggered a high-level database access, captain-level authorization. I didn't understand everything she was showing me. Terminal IDs, access logs, time-stamps lining up perfectly. But I understood enough to know this wasn't just a neighborhood issue anymore. Over the next few days, planted more bait. A whispered rumor about interstate fraud investigations, casually mentioned while borrowing sugar from a neighbor. A staged phone call, loud enough for a passerby to overhear, about witness protection coordination. Each rumor had its own invisible tag, like a digital die that glowed once it moved through the network. And every single one of them triggered responses, not from directly but from inside the police department. Calls, meetings, database queries at levels ordinary officers couldn't touch. One evening, as I pulled weeds from the flower bed, I heard her voice float over from her porch, strained, panicked. "We've got a problem. She's spooking the residents. They're asking questions." She didn't realize was sitting quietly inside, recording every word with what she claimed was just consumer equipment, though I had my doubts. When hung up's voice was steady. "Captain," she said, scribbling the name down, "that's their handler." I stared at her. "Handler? You make it sound like this is organized." Met my eyes, and for the first time I saw a flash of something behind her calm. Not fear, but a recognition. This isn't just HOA harassment. This is institutional. Not helping her, he's running her. That night the house was quiet except for the low hum of equipment. I sat in the dark living room, staring at the glow from her laptop across the hall. Every so often, I'd hear the faint scratch of her pen as she logged another detail, another timestamp. At one point, she looked up at me and said something that sent a chill through my chest. "They think they're watching us, but I'm watching them." And she was right. Because over the next week, their panic told the whole story. Emergency late-night calls from s porch. Extra patrol cars circling the neighborhood like sharks in shallow water. Neighbors whispering about federal investigations without realizing they'd been handed those words like poisoned candy. Piece by piece was peeling back the mask. And beneath it, we weren't looking at a nosy HOA president anymore. We were looking at a police captain running a criminal conspiracy under the color of law. I didn't know how far was willing to take this, but I did know one thing. The moment said that man's name out loud, our quiet suburban conflict crossed a line it could never step back from. Sometimes, the scariest thing isn't realizing you're being watched. It's realizing the people watching you are the same ones wearing the badge that's supposed to protect you. It was just after dawn when I heard the engines. Not one, not two, but a whole convoy rolling up our street. I looked out the window and felt my stomach drop. Patrol cars lined the curb, doors slamming in unison, officers fanning out across the lawn like we were some kind of cartel hideout. Our neighbors stood on porches in their pajamas, whispering in shock. The sound of radios crackled in the cool morning air. And then I saw him, Sergeant Miller, stepping out of the lead vehicle with the kind of swagger that made it clear he thought this was already won. "County warrant," he barked, holding up a thick folder stuffed with paperwork. For systematic interference with law enforcement operations, cyber obstruction of justice, conspiracy to impede municipal investigations. The words rolled off his tongue like rehearsed theater. My chest tightened. The charges weren't just serious, they were life-destroying. But when I glanced at, I didn't see panic. I saw something else. A stillness, a calculation. She didn't fight them, she didn't argue, she broke. Or at least that's what it looked like. Her voice trembled. Federal charges? We don't even understand what you're talking about. She wrapped her arms around herself, shaking like she was holding in sobs. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She sounded like any terrified wife who had just seen her world collapse. I knew it was an act, but they didn't. Miller smirked as his men stormed through the door, gloves snapping as they rifled through drawers, lifting cushions, pulling cords. And then came the discoveries. Shiny computer equipment we'd never owned. Files labeled with crimes we'd never committed. A stack of documents that smelled like they'd just come out of a printer. "Look what we've got here," Miller announced with satisfaction, holding up a hard drive like it was a trophy. Systematic hacking tools, federal identity manipulation records. Neighbors gasped from outside the windows. Mrs. clutched her robe, whispering prayers under her breath. Miller grinned, certain that the show he was putting on would convince everyone watching. But's performance, it was flawless. She stumbled back against the wall, her voice breaking. Please, we're just regular people. We have a mortgage, car payments. We've never even seen that equipment before." Her tears weren't crocodile. They looked real, felt real. Even I almost believed them. The younger officers shifted uncomfortably. I saw one glance at another, doubt flickering in his eyes. Saw it too, and she leaned into it. "Why are you doing this to us?" she cried. "We just wanted to help our neighbors. We never hurt anyone." That's the thing about corruption. It thrives in silence, in shadows. But when you drag it into daylight, when the people carrying it out start to feel the weight of eyes on them, cracks appear. The officers kept planting evidence, but their confidence wavered. You could feel it in the room. The supposed forensics looked too clean, too staged, and desperation made us look like victims of something much bigger than a HOA dispute. Outside, neighbors gathered. Some shouted at the officers. "Leave them alone," one man yelled. "They've done nothing but help us." The crowd grew louder, angrier. The story was shifting, not us as suspects, but us as targets. Miller's smirk faltered. His eyes darted between the planted evidence and the swelling crowd. For the first time, he looked less like a man in control and more like someone realizing his stage play wasn't going the way he'd rehearsed. Dropped her head into her hands, voice shaking with practiced despair. "Please, we don't even understand what's happening. Why would anyone want to ruin our lives?" And in that moment, she wasn't just convincing the neighbors. She was convincing the officers themselves. Because the truth is, even the corrupt can't stand looking too closely at their own reflection. By the time Miller ordered his team to wrap up, the damage was already done. They thought they'd scared us. They thought they'd humiliated us. But all they really did was turn the whole neighborhood into witnesses. And once people see injustice with their own eyes, you can't unsee it. You can't forget it. By day 3, stopped hiding behind citations and statistics. She brought in a lawyer, the kind of man who smelled like expensive cologne and bad intentions. His name was Gregory, and the moment he stepped through our door, I knew he wasn't here to negotiate, he was here to intimidate. He set a thick folder down on our kitchen table with a thud, then straightened his tie. "A settlement," he said smoothly, "to resolve your complications with the HOA and county authorities. A generous resolution considering the circumstances." Sat quietly, her hands folded on her lap, eyes lowered like she was too broken to fight anymore. I knew better. I'd seen that look before. She was reading him, studying every word, every tick, every flick of his hand. Slid the document toward us. $15,000, he continued. Paid immediately. In exchange, federal charges disappear. Prison time avoided. My breath caught. 15,000. That was more than our savings, more than we could survive losing. I looked at, expecting panic. But she just tilted her head slightly, flipping the papers open with slow, deliberate fingers. Her voice was shaky at first. 15,000? That would wipe out our children's college fund. We'd lose our home. Leaned back, smirking. Reasonable cost compared to 10 years in federal prison, Mrs. Silence filled the kitchen. The hum of the fridge, the faint creak of the ceiling fan. Then's tone shifted, subtle but sharp. "Mister," she said softly, "this itemized breakdown here, $950 for mailbox covenant violations." She tapped the page with her finger. "Funny, the original citation was only $25. Smile faltered for the briefest moment. Sitting smugly beside him, leaned forward. "Mrs., questioning settlement terms after preliminary acceptance creates unnecessary legal complications." Cut her off, her voice suddenly stronger. "Unnecessary legal complications, or exposing fraud, which is it, Mrs. Roberts?" The room shifted, cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This is a standard resolution document." Stood slowly, deliberately. She crossed the kitchen and pulled our old paper shredder from under the counter, plugged it in. The machine whirred to life with a low hum. His face paled. "What are you doing?" Didn't flinch. She held up the document, her voice steady now, ringing with authority. "Disposing of a criminal conspiracy disguised as a legal settlement." And then she fed it in. The grinding sound filled the room, paper turning to confetti. Strip by strip, settlement disappeared, shot to her feet, furious, her voice rising. "You just destroyed a binding legal agreement." His reply cut like a blade. "I destroyed fraudulent extortion. Real settlements require judges. Real settlements require court filings. This," she gestured to the shredded pile, "this was a scam." His hands shook as she fumbled for her phone. I heard her whisper, panicked, "Complete compromise, she knows." Looked from two, suddenly realizing the script had flipped. Wasn't the victim anymore, she was the hunter. She leaned across the table, her eyes locked on. "You didn't hand me a settlement. You handed me evidence, and you just proved in front of your own lawyer that you're running a criminal operation under color of law." The room went still. Evan's arrogance cracked. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Unplugged the shredder, lifted her chin, and spoke quietly but with weight that made the walls seem closer. "You thought I was breaking. You thought I was desperate. But what you really did, Mrs. Roberts, was hand internal affairs the final piece I needed." The truth was no longer hiding in fine print. It was out in the open, and its empire of intimidation had just started to collapse. We barely had minutes after shredded that so-called settlement before the street lit up again. Headlights, flashing reds and blues, engines rumbling like thunder rolling into the cul-de-sac. This time it wasn't just patrol cars. It was a full tactical response. SWAT gear, armored vans, radios blaring orders. The kind of overkill you'd expect for a hostage standoff, not a suburban couple with a mailbox citation. Neighbors poured out onto lawns, clutching their robes and coffee mugs, whispering in shock. I heard Mrs. gasp, "God help them!" Her words floated through the night air, swallowed by the heavy thump of boots pounding across our driveway. And then I saw him, Captain himself. He stepped out of a black command vehicle like a man used to being the final authority. His posture was relaxed, confident, like he already owned the outcome. He wasn't just leading a raid, he was staging a performance. "Detective," he said coldly, striding toward our front door. My blood froze. He hadn't even looked at me, he was staring straight at. Stood in the doorway, calm as stone, as rattled on. "County oversight wasn't briefed about an active investigation here. You've interfered with operational stability, compromised departmental authority." But he stopped, because stepped forward, badge in hand. The kitchen light caught it, and for a moment it glittered like a weapon sharper than any rifle in his arsenal. "Captain," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Internal affairs doesn't require your briefing, especially not when investigating corruption under your command." The silence that followed was electric. Officers shifted. Neighbors leaned forward, wide-eyed. Standing behind went pale as chalk. Smirk cracked. "Internal affairs," he muttered, his voice betraying the first hint of panic. Opened a thick folder she'd been building for months. Pages fanned out, timestamps, financial records, database access logs. $50,000 transferred annually from Roberts Enterprises to your community liaison accounts, she recited. Law enforcement credentials used to fabricate criminal records against residents. Coordination meetings logged, recorded, and witnessed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "I knew it, I knew they were dirty." Took a step back, his eyes darting around. His tactical team looked uncertain now, their rifles lowering slightly. His tone sharpened. Organized corruption using the color of law, abuse of authority for financial gain, systematic harassment of civilians. You've crossed every line, Captain. Clutched her phone, trembling, her earlier arrogance replaced with naked fear. This can't. Cut her off without looking at her. Mrs. Roberts, when you targeted my family, you didn't just harass neighbors. You handed internal affairs evidence of a criminal conspiracy. The weight of her words settled over the street like fog. His tactical spectacle had turned into his public downfall. Unmarked cars rolled in quietly from the opposite end of the block. Men in plain suits stepped out, moving with calm authority. One of them spoke into a radio, then called out across the lawn. "Lieutenant, County Internal Affairs, all units stand down." The shift was immediate. Officers who had come to intimidate now lowered their weapons, some even stepping aside as and his team advanced. "Captain," announced, his voice sharp and final. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and abuse of police authority under color of law." Handcuffs clicked. His defiance cracked into desperate protests, screamed something about partnership programs and revenue enhancement, but no one was listening anymore. Because the neighborhood had already decided who they believed. Closed her folder with quiet finality. Her voice softened as she addressed the residents now clustered in the street. "I'm sorry for the secrecy," she said, "but this was never just about mailboxes. It was about protecting every family here from a system designed to exploit you." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Anderson stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Thank you for saving us." And that was the moment finally realized what she had lost. Not just money, not just power, but the one thing she'd used as her weapon all along, the community's trust. Sometimes justice doesn't roar with sirens. Sometimes it's the quiet click of handcuffs in the night, when a bully finally realizes they've run out of people to scare. The street was quiet again the next morning. No patrol cars. No boots on our lawn, just the sound of birds and sprinklers as if nothing had happened. But we all knew everything had changed. News traveled fast. Local papers called it the Heights corruption scandal. Cameras swarmed the courthouse steps, and for once and weren't the ones setting the stage, they were the spectacle. The trial was packed. Neighbors filled benches usually reserved for reporters. Mrs. Anderson sat near the front, clutching tissues, her head held high for the first time in months. Even the old man who'd been fined for his holiday wreath showed up, cane in hand, whispering, "I wouldn't miss this for the world." Sat at the defense table, stiff in his uniform, but there was no authority left in his posture. Just a man shrinking under the weight of his own arrogance. Looked smaller too, her designer clothes suddenly a costume, not armor. With calm precision, she wasn't angry. She wasn't theatrical. She simply laid out the evidence she had been collecting all along, the money transfers, the forged statistics, the planted records. Every word landed like a nail in a coffin. "Captain coordinated criminal enterprise under the color of law," she told the jury, badge gleaming under the lights. "Systematic extortion of civilians, fabricated charges, harassment disguised as community protection." The defense tried to spin it. They claimed municipal innovation, budget constraints, creative revenue programs, but himself destroyed their argument when he took the stand. "Municipal budgets cannot sustain operations without partnership revenue," he said bluntly. "Civilian contributions are necessary for departmental stability." The courtroom went dead silent. You could feel the disbelief hanging in the air. He wasn't defending himself. He was confessing that he believed organized extortion was a legitimate funding model. The jury didn't take long. "Guilty, guilty, several officers guilty," Sentences ranged from 2 to 5 years depending on their roles. Got the harshest, 5 years for corruption, conspiracy, and abuse of authority. Got 3. When the gavel struck, neighbors wept. Not because the punishments were harsh, but because justice had finally caught up to people who thought they were untouchable. But the story didn't end in the courtroom. Heights became a case study. County officials passed a new law, the Community Protection Act, banning police partnerships that pulled money from neighborhoods. Oversight committees were formed. Independent audits became mandatory. And in the middle of town, where once planted fear with her staged meetings, neighbors built something else. A memorial garden. Flowers, benches. A plaque honoring residents who had been harassed and the investigators who stopped it. 3 years later, that garden still blooms. Kids play tag between rows bushes. Retirees sit with coffee and newspapers. Families gather each spring for a ceremony, not to remember the fear, but to celebrate that it's gone. Doesn't like the spotlight, but the county promoted her anyway, Chief of Internal Affairs Task Force. She framed the article about the case, hung it beside our brass mailbox, and said with a smile, full circle. That mailbox, once a symbol of harassment, is now permanently protected under the very law helped create, without even knowing it. Sometimes justice doesn't just punish. It plants something better in the soil where corruption tried to grow. I still think about that first creak of our gate, the dust on my boots, the paper that felt too heavy to be just a fine. Small details, ordinary moments. The kind you almost forget until they change everything. Because in the end, it wasn't about a mailbox. It was about a neighborhood learning that no one, not even those hiding behind badges and titles, is above accountability. And maybe the biggest lesson is this. Bullies can wear uniforms, clipboards, even expensive suits. But the moment truth walks into the room, their power evaporates. 3 years later, the flowers still bloom where fear once lived. And every time I hear the quiet hum of our shredder, I remember the sound of paper turning to confetti. The moment a $950 scam unraveled into justice for an entire community. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.